One of the more underappreciated aspects of Jimmy Carter's political acumen is the savvy, groundbreaking campaign strategy he and his team put together that ultimately won them the 1976 election. On this episode of Recollecting Carter, I talk with Dr. Amber Roessner about her recent book, Jimmy Carter and the Birth of the Marathon Media Campaign. It shows how Carter used imagecraft and showbiz politics to fuel his unlikely rise.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear
The time for racial discrimination is over.
that I will faithfully execute
An undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
the office of President of the United States
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
and will, to the best of my ability,
It is a crisis of confidence.
preserve, protect, and defend
To remove the light of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I would have.
the Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
Hi, I'm Amber Roessner, professor at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I'm originally from Winder, Georgia, and I attended the University of Georgia's College of Journalism and Mass Communication. I got my PhD from there in 2010 and began work around that time on a book about the rise of Jimmy Carter in the 1976 campaign and his presidency.
The first thing I want to ask is, why write a book? Why write a book about Jimmy Carter 40 years after his presidency? What interested you in Carter, and why did you want to write more about him?
Well, that's a really good question. One that I was certainly asked along the way by a couple of colleagues. My first book was about sports journalism in the early 20th century and this concept of hero crafting, image craft, that really takes place at the intersection of journalism and advertising and public relations. And so for some, it was like, why is this sports historian suddenly really interested in modern presidential history? For me, it was kind of looking at another prominent American icon, another prominent regional Southern icon, and really looking at this process or practice of image craft. And certainly, Jimmy Carter was someone who always fascinated me growing up in the state of Georgia. I was definitely interested in pursuing the topic of his rise in the 76 campaign. And certainly I started that process as soon as I got to the University of Tennessee. I'm really diving into the secondary research, recognizing that this was a really important time to revisit the life and the career of Jimmy Carter, because really his presidency had been written off as a failed presidency. And I think it's really important to, recognize why was it written off as a failed presidency? That's really about our cultural values of what a successful presidency looks like. And really, our cultural values about what a successful presidency looks like, it's tethered to how economically successful we were during that moment, by and large, I think, if you look back at presidential history.
Do you think that Carter already had his eye on the White House even at that early stage? When does he make that transition?
So in terms of, there's some debate in terms of when Carter begins to have these kind of presidential ambitions. And to some degree, it's because he had this kind of Kennedy-esque vibe about him that certainly the New York Times was writing about when he gives that inaugural address. I mean, people were comparing his looks and his mannerisms to Kennedy. And then the nation still yearned for that, right? And it's a couple of years removed from the assassination of Bobby, right? And so that Kennedy name still has a lot of cultural sway, as it still does, right? But point being, people are drawing some comparisons. Journalists are drawing some comparisons to the two men in terms of their charisma. I would contend that when he is giving that inaugural address, he's already has the presidential ambitions.
What are some of the aspects that made Carter's campaign strategy more media savvy than campaigns that had gone before?
And certainly he's running on an extended logic of showbiz politics, right? That we really see the birth of nationally with Kennedy in the mid-century, Eisenhower and Kennedy in the mid-century. He's tapping into celebrity endorsements, in Carter's case, from regional celebrities that are huge on the national scene, like the Allman Brothers. He's recognizing that the Allman Brothers really blend uniquely with what this idea of like redneck Southern chic, that has captured the nation's imagination. So it's an extension of the logic of showbiz politics. It's also kind of an extension of an outsider's campaign for the presidency, which really also, like Kennedy was tapping into some of that in the 60s, running kind of as an outsider. He was running a public media campaign, meaning he was getting out there, knocking on doors in Iowa and New Hampshire, but he was making damn sure that he was attracting media attention for doing so. Political scientist Samuel Colonel talks about this notion of going public, right? Nixon certainly was a master of going public through television. I make the argument that Carter was a master of going local during the Invisible Campaign. The Invisible Campaign, of course, is this period prior to election year where the press was increasingly noticing what was going on with politicians, presidential aspirants. But Carter is making major inroads in that moment. The news media, based in their perceived failures from the election cycle prior in 72, would focus a ton of attention on Iowa in 76. And so they really set up a masterful apparatus there in Iowa, for lack of a better word. And it's interesting because initially, so Carter announces his intent to run for president in December of 74. And he announces unofficially before a crowd of reporters at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. And it's interesting because a major reporter, Jack Nelson for the LA Times, says, because Carter was concerned that it might get out that he was going to run for office before he officially announced. And Nelson says, like, that doesn't matter. It's whether the press gives a damn. And, certainly after he announces in mid-December, the press does kind of take little note of it. And he gets some notice in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun. But there aren't the major headlines that he had hoped for.
And that's pretty innovative, right? Like, one of the main reasons that Iowa and New Hampshire play such an outsized role in early presidential race coverage today is because of the Carter team's insight that this was an opportunity to use media, and they did that in a way that people just weren't doing before.
Well, I mean, this is kind of a landmark presidential cycle, if you think about it, because it's operating under the quote-unquote new rules of American politics.
Post-Watergate and all the campaign finance reform.
Post-campaign finance reform, but also like post-presidential reform in general. So in other words, post-McGovern-Visor Commission reforms, which essentially give us a system in which you're not getting a nominee that's a favorite son that's been vetted by party bosses in back rooms, that suddenly primaries and caucuses are kind of deciding factors on who is the nominee. And of course, that's just post 68, right? And those reforms come about due to the fact that Hubert Humphrey is the nominee in 68 without ever contesting a primary.
So, like all presidents, Carter remained in the news. Certainly, every 4 years for a presidential election, past presidents are going to come up. And Carter has been known as an especially gracious past president to the presidents that came after him, no matter their political leanings. He was quick to reach out to Bill Clinton during his scandals. One thing that brought Carter into the news more recently was when President Donald Trump reached out to him about relations in China in 2018. Do you think with that moment, all of a sudden seeing the juxtaposition of President Trump and President Carter, even though it was about a valid issue, was that a moment, do you think, in the reimagining of Carter?
So I think that, Trump reaches out because he wants Carter to offer some credibility to that move. From what you just said, from that question, what instead was resonating with me was this idea that in 92, during that campaign, Clinton actively didn't want to have much to do with Jimmy Carter because he was seen as a failed president, because he was seen as a pariah in his own party, that some of the other individuals who were running for office, particularly Paul Zongas, did see the value of embracing Carter and thought that Plains should be a mecca for anyone running for presidential office. Well, then, turn around 40 years later, and we see that moment come to fruition in which Plains, there is a path to Plains for anyone who wants to seek higher office during that campaign cycle. You have people who are actively wanting to embrace Carter as an outsider, right? I think that, I think that Trump in 18 did want Carter to legitimize that move for him.
I mean, Carter went so far as to say at one point that Trump should win the Nobel Peace Prize if his efforts with North Korea were successful. And, of course, Carter, like all true Americans, would roundly condemn Trump's later actions. But that was a pretty gracious thing to say, especially from Carter, who is a Nobel winner himself.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I talk about this a good bit in my epilogue, which, by the way, as a historian, when your publisher's like, yeah, we need you to work to move this up to present day, and we really need you to think about the 2016 election cycle, you're like, oh, I mean, that's what I said. But I saw a lot of parallels between Carter's rise in 76 and Trump's in 16. They're both anti-establishment candidates, kind of not unknown outsiders, but outsiders, right?
To national politics.
They're running against the establishment. And part of that establishment for both of them is the news media, right? And so what helped Trump's cause to an unprecedented degree was the attacks on the credibility of our news media that had been happening since Agnew and since Carter, right? Because Carter engaged in that too very effectively. And so that opens the door for Trump. He understands that news cycle largely based upon his own experience as a celebrity. He understands how the news cycle works. And anytime there's a headline that he doesn't like, he's able to distract, but he's also able to undermine the headline by attacking the partisan liberal establishment news media. and very effectively. But that's all a part of the Carter playbook, right? And that's something that we kind of take for granted and don't recognize.
I think that many assume that it's always been this way. Like we have some sort of vague picture that even Washington and Adams and Jefferson were these savvy manipulators of public opinion. And I mean, in some ways they were. In some ways, the press was more partisan in their time, even than it is now. But it's that media piece, the mass communication technology that enables constant engagement, 24-hour news cycles, social media, and on and on. And that's the piece that I think that your book really demonstrates. So many books on the history of media and the presidency have focused on Eisenhower and Kennedy, who were there at the beginning of television. But yours really shows that transition point in so many ways. And it's a transition point in the history of media, in the history of cultural and racial relations in our country, and in the history of conservative politics and their antagonism with what they perceive to be the liberal media.
I mean, in fact, I would make the argument it's a moment of rupture that has really overdetermined the moment in which we live now.
Dr. Roessner, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.